My name is Eleanor Voss, and I am 43 years old, and I am sitting in the kitchen of a house in Portland, Oregon, on a rainy Tuesday morning in November, with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that has long since gone cold. And I am going to tell you a story that I have been carrying inside me for so long that it has become part of my physical architecture, part of the way I breathe, and the way I hold my shoulders, and the way I pause before I answer certain questions. A story that begins with a lie so enormous and so deliberately constructed and so carefully maintained over so many years that even now, even after everything has been revealed and everything has been confronted, and everything has been as resolved as things of this magnitude can ever be resolved. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night and lie in the dark and feel the weight of what was done, not just to me, not just to my children, but to a man named James Voss, who spent 10 years believing his family had been taken from him, and who searched for us across 3 states and 17 cities, and who knocked on doors and filed legal motions and hired investigators and sat in courtrooms and wrote letters and made phone calls and did every single thing a man can do within the boundaries of what the law allows, and some things that tested those boundaries, and who did all of this because he loved us, because he loved his children and he loved me, and because the alternative to searching, the alternative to believing that we were out there somewhere and that finding us was possible, was a darkness that he was not willing to enter. And I know this now because he told me, because we have had the conversations that you have when 10 years of absence are finally ended, and when two people who loved each other and were separated by the deliberate cruelty of another person finally sit across a table and try to understand what happened and what it cost and what, if anything, can be recovered from the wreckage of a decade of manufactured grief. The lie was my mother's. I need to say that clearly and without softening it, because I spent too many years softening it. Too many years finding the generous framing, too many years explaining my mother to myself and to my children in the language of complexity and circumstance and the specific generosity that daughters extend to mother, even when those mothers have done unforgivable things. And I am done with the softening because the softening was itself a form of the lie, a continuation of it, a way of making the unbearable slightly more bearable, by making the person who caused the unbearable slightly more sympathetic than the evidence actually supported. And the evidence does not support sympathy. The evidence supports the specific, cold, clear-eyed assessment that my mother, Margaret Calloway, looked at her 2 grandchildren and looked at her daughter and looked at the man her daughter loved and decided, with full deliberate intention and sustained commitment over a period of more than 10 years, that James Voss should not exist in our lives. And she made him not exist by telling us he was dead. And she told us he was dead with such completeness and such specific detail and such unwavering consistency across every interaction and every conversation and every moment in which his name might have been raised that my children grew up, believing their father had died in a car accident on a rainy highway outside of Denver when the youngest was 3 years old and the oldest was 6. And they grieved him the way children grieve, parents they lose early, with the specific, incomplete grief of people who are old enough to understand that something has been taken from them, but too young to understand fully what the thing was or how its absence will shape everything that follows. And my daughter Emma, who is now 19, wore a locket with her father's photograph in it every single day, from the time she was 7 years old until the day she was 17. And standing in a courthouse hallway in Portland, Oregon, looking at a man who was not dead, who had never been dead, who was standing 12 feet away from her with his hands at his sides and tears running down his face, and who looked at her with the specific devastated recognition of a father who is seeing his daughter for the first time in 14 years, and who is trying to absorb the fact that she exists in 3 dimensions and is real and present and alive in the years of searching. Because allowing yourself to fully imagine the thing you have lost is a particular allowing yourself to fully imagine itself becomes the wound. That a person can all kind for stain, for so long before the imagination spurgeon. In the years the I coarsen before the imagination itself becomes the wound. And my son Marcus, who is now 22, who was 6 years old when we left Denver, and who has his father's eyes and his father's way of going still when he is thinking hard about something. Marcus, who spent his entire adolescence carrying the weight of being the man of the family, the responsibility that falls on the eldest child when a parent is gone, the specific gravity of being both a child who needs to be taken care of and a person who has been designated as one who takes care, Marcus, who was 20 when he found out the truth, and who sat in my kitchen for 3 hours after I told him, without saying a single word, and then stood up and put on his coat and walked out the door and drove away, and didn't call me for 11 days. 11 days during which I did not know if he was ever going to speak to me again, and during which I sat with the specific agony of a mother who has failed her child in a way that cannot be undone, who has allowed a harm to be done that she could have prevented if she had been braver, or more suspicious, or less willing to believe the person she most needed to be able to believe. 11 days of silence that ended when Marcus called me from a parking lot outside a coffee shop in Seattle, where he had driven without telling anyone, because he needed to be somewhere no one knew him, while he processed something that was, by any measure, unpossibles, and he called me and said, very quietly, "Mom, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. Everything you knew, and everything you didn't know, and everything you believed, and everything you should have questioned. All of it. I need to understand how this happened." And I told him. All of it. From the beginning. And now I am going to tell you, because this story deserves to be told in full, and because there are things in it that I believe other people need to hear, and because carrying it alone has cost me enough, and I am ready to put it down in the only way that a story can be put down, which is by telling it completely and honestly, and without the softening that I have been practicing for too long. I grew up in Billings, Montana, the only child of Robert and Margaret Calloway, and I want to tell you about my mother from the beginning, because understanding her is not the same as excusing her, and because the story of what she did is also, inevitably, the story of who she was. And who she was is something I have spent 43 years trying to understand with varying degrees of success, and always with the specific difficulty that comes from trying to see clearly someone whose face you have been looking at your entire life, and whose face therefore carries too much meaning, too many memories, too much love, and too much pain, all woven together into an expression that you cannot read with the objectivity it requires. My mother was the daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants who had come to Montana in the 1950s, and who had brought with them a set of values about family and loyalty, and the proper ordering of social relationships that were specific to their generation and their culture, and that expressed themselves in my mother's personality as a fierce protectiveness of the family unit, and a deep, abiding suspicion of anything or anyone who threatened to disrupt that unit. And by disruption, I mean anything that deviated from the specific vision of family that my mother held, which was ordered and contained, and operating within boundaries that she could see and understand and control. And the controlling was the thing. The controlling was always the thing with my mother. The need to be the person who understood the shape of everything, and who maintained that shape through the specific force of her personality, and her will, and her capacity for sustained, patient management of situations and people in ways that were so subtle and so gradual that you did not recognize them as management until you were so thoroughly managed that the recognition came too late to be useful. My father, Robert, was a kind man and a quiet one, an accountant, who liked fishing and crossword puzzles and who loved my mother with the specific, uncomplicated devotion of a man who has found the person he wants to be with, and who has organized his entire life around being with that person, and who had, over the course of 30 years of marriage, gradually and almost imperceptibly ceded to my mother the management of everything that fell outside the category of his professional work, so that the household and the social life and the family relationships and the decisions about how things should be were all in my mother's domain. And he moved through that domain with the comfortable ease of a person who trusts the manager, and who has no desire to challenge the management, because the management, from his perspective, was working. Everything was organized and functional, and the family was intact, and his daughter was provided for, and his wife was happy, and his wife's happiness was, for Robert Calloway, both the goal and the evidence of success. And he did not look too closely at the methods by which that happiness was achieved, because the looking closely would have required him to challenge things. And challenging things was not who Robert was. And I loved my father for his gentleness, and I love his memory now, and I understand that his gentleness was also a form of abdication, the specific abdication of a good man who loved his wife too much to see her clearly, and that this abdication had consequences that extended far beyond anything he ever intended or imagined. I was a happy child in the way that children are happy when they are loved and provided for, And when the world they live in is consistent and safe, which my childhood was, consistently and safely managed by my mother into a particular shape that I accepted as the natural shape of things, because it was the only shape I had ever known. I did well in school. I had friends. I was not a remarkable child in any way that demanded special attention, which was, I think in retrospect, exactly what my mother preferred, a daughter who was present and well-functioning, and who did not create situations that required management from outside the family, who did not introduce elements that my mother could not control, who was simply and ordinarily hers, in the way that a well-tended garden is the gardener's, shaped and maintained and predictably beautiful, within the boundaries that had been established for it. I went to the University of Montana in Missoula, which was far enough from Billings to feel like independence, but close enough that my mother could drive there in 4 hours if she needed to, which she did, several times, arriving with food and advice, and the specific concerned oversight of a mother who believes that her daughter's welfare is best served by her continued presence in the management of that welfare. And I received these visits with the mixed feelings that daughters receive such visits, gratitude and slight suffocation in roughly equal measure. And I did not examine the suffocation too closely, because examining it would have meant acknowledging something about my mother that I was not yet ready to acknowledge. I met James Voss in the second semester of my junior year. He was in my comparative literature class, a tall, quiet man from a small town in Colorado, who was studying environmental science and who had ended up in the comparative literature class because he had read the course description wrong and had not realized his error until the first day of class, at which point he had decided to stay because the professor seemed interesting, and because changing a class 2 days before AdDrop ended seemed like more effort than staying, and this accidental presence in a room he had not intended to be in was the specific randomness of circumstance that brought him to me, that put him in the seat 2 rows behind mine in a classroom in Missoula, Montana, where he sat and listened to the professor discuss the nature of narrative and the unreliable narrator and the ways that stories construct reality, rather than simply reflecting it, and the irony of that particular subject matter in that particular room, where James and I first became aware of each other, is something I have thought about many times since. The specific irony of 2 people who would become the subjects of the most devastating, unreliable narrative of their lives meeting. In a classroom, where the unreliable narrator was being discussed as a literary device, as if the universe had a sense of humor about these things, or at least a sense of foreshadowing. He introduced himself after class on the 3rd week, because I had made a comment during the discussion that he disagreed with, and that he wanted to argue about, and the arguing was immediate and comfortable and mutually enjoyable in the way that arguments are when 2 people are genuinely interested in the ideas they are arguing about. And when the arguing is a form of engagement, rather than a form of combat. And we stood outside the classroom building in the cold Montana afternoon for 40 minutes, arguing about whether the unreliable narrator is a literary trick or a philosophical position, and by the end of the 40 minutes, we had resolved nothing about the unreliable narrator, and had agreed to continue the argument over coffee. And the coffee became dinner, and the dinner became weeks of evenings, and the evenings became a relationship that I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. The relationship that felt like arriving somewhere rather than continuing to travel. The specific comfort and excitement of being with someone who was genuinely interested in the things you were interested in, and who challenged your thinking without diminishing your confidence, and who made you feel simultaneously more yourself, and more than yourself, which is what love does when it is the right kind. When it is the kind that grows you rather than the kind that contains you. James was different from the men my mother would have chosen for me, which I recognized at some level without fully articulating it, different in ways that I found compelling, and that I understood even then might be problematic for her. Because different for my mother was not an interesting quality but a concerning one, because different meant outside the parameters she had established for the shape of my life, and outside those parameters was where things could go wrong, where the management became difficult, where the garden grew in directions that the gardener had not intended, and that disrupted the design she had been carefully maintaining. He was from Colorado, not Montana, which meant he was not from the network of families and communities that my mother understood and could assess could not be placed within the social map that she maintained in her head, the map that told her who people were and where they came from, and what their presence in her daughter's life meant for the shape of that life. He was not Catholic, which was not a deal breaker for my mother in the formal sense, but which was a mark against him in the informal sense. The informal sense being the one that actually governed her assessments. He was studying environmental science, which my mother associated with a kind of idealism that she distrusted. The idealism of people who prioritize abstract concerns over concrete ones, who are more interested in the world they want to exist than in the world that actually exists, which was unfair to James, who was rigorous and practical in his approach to his field, but which was how my mother framed things she didn't trust, by finding the least flattering interpretation and presenting it as the accurate one. She met him when she visited in March of that year, arriving on a Friday evening with a car full of food and the specific concerned energy of a woman who has heard something in her daughter's voice on the phone that suggested the presence of a variable she had not accounted for. And she was right. There was a variable she had not accounted for, and his name was James Voss. And he came to dinner that Saturday at the apartment I shared with my roommate. And he was charming and attentive and genuinely interested in my mother, in the way that he was genuinely interested in everyone he met. Asking questions and listening to the answers and following up with more questions that showed he had been paying attention. And my mother smiled and was gracious and said the right things and was everything that a mother should be when meeting her daughter's boyfriend for the first time. And on Sunday morning, after James had left, she sat at my kitchen table with her coffee and she said, "He seems like a nice young man." And she paused, and in the pause was everything she was not saying, which was that she had concerns, that she had observations, that she had the beginning of a case against James Voss, that she was going to build slowly and patiently over the coming months, because that was how she built things, slowly and patiently. Because she understood that the direct approach produces resistance, and that the indirect approach, the gradual approach, the approach that operates through implication and tone, and the strategic placement of doubts, that approach produces the result she wanted without the resistance that directness would have generated. She said, "He seems like a nice young man." And I heard the pause, and I chose not to examine the pause because I was 20 years old and I was in love, and examining the pause would have meant entering into a conversation I was not ready for, and I said, "He is." And she said, "Good." And we talked about other things. And the pause sat between us like a seed that she was going to water for the next several years until it grew into something I would have to reckon with. I graduated from the University of Montana in the spring of my senior year, and James and I made the decision together, in the specific collaborative way of people who have decided their futures are intertwined, to move to Denver, where James had been offered a position with an environmental consulting firm, and where I had been offered a position with a communications organization that aligned with my degree. And we moved to Denver in July, and we found an apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and we built a life together in the incremental, ordinary way that lives are built, furniture and routines, and the gradual deepening of the particular intimacy that comes from sharing daily life with someone, the intimacy of knowing how they take their coffee and what they say when they are stressed, and the sound of their breathing in the dark, and the specific warmth of their presence in the ordinary moments that make up the majority of a life and that are, in retrospect, the most valuable parts of it, even though they feel unremarkable while you are living them. My mother called 3 times a week. The calls were warm and interested, and full of the specific questions that mothers ask about the practical details of their children's lives. Questions about work and health and finances and the apartment, and they were also full of the specific observations that my mother had been perfecting since March. The observations that were never direct criticisms of James, but that were arranged in ways that produced doubt, that suggested insufficiency, that implied concern without stating it, that built a picture of James Voss as someone whose adequacy for the life he was building with me was a question worth considering. She mentioned once, very casually, that his family background seemed unstable, by which she meant that his parents had divorced when he was 12, which she had learned from something I had mentioned, and which she had filed and was now deploying as evidence of something without stating what the evidence was evidence of. She mentioned once, equally casually, that men who study environmental science often struggle to find financial stability, which was both a generalization and an inaccuracy, and which she delivered with the tone of someone sharing a concern she had heard from a reliable source. She mentioned that he seemed very focused on his career in ways that might leave less room for family, which was the opposite of her actual concern about him, which was that he was too present, too interested in me, too solidly part of my life, and that his presence was reducing her influence in ways that she was not willing to accept. I heard the observations. I heard them the way you hear background music, aware of its presence without fully processing its content. And I discounted them the way daughters discount their mother's concerns about the men they love, with the specific generosity of someone who believes that love makes them a more accurate judge of the beloved than someone who is not in love. And I was partly right about this and partly wrong. And the part where I was wrong was the part where I did not understand clearly enough that my mother's concerns were not really about James at all, but about me. About keeping me within the orbit she had established for my life. And that James was simply the most significant threat to that orbit she had yet encountered. We were married when I was 24, a small ceremony in Denver, because we could not afford the elaborate wedding my mother had imagined. And because James and I wanted something that was ours rather than something that was organized around other people's expectations, and my mother came to the wedding and wore a beautiful dress and smiled in all the photographs and made a gracious toast and behaved, in every observable way, like a mother who was happy for her daughter, and I believed the behavior because I needed to believe it and because the alternative to believing it was acknowledging something about my mother that I had been carefully not acknowledging for years. Emma was born when I was 26, and Marcus was born when I was 29. And the years between Emma's birth and the events I am about to describe were, in their texture and their dailiness, genuinely good years. Years of the ordinary happiness that comes from building something together. From watching children grow and surprising yourself with the love you feel for them, and navigating the specific challenges of 2 careers and 2 children, and the management of a life that is fuller than either person fully anticipated and richer for the fullness. James was a good father. I want to say that clearly and without qualification, because it matters and because it is the truth, and because the story that was eventually constructed about him by my mother depended entirely on the erasure of this truth, and the truth was that James Voss loved his children with the specific, wholehearted love of a man who had not had an easy childhood himself, and who had therefore decided, consciously and deliberately, to be present for his children in ways that his own parents had not been present for him. And he was present. He was there for the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. He was the parent who remembered the things the children said and brought them up later, who knew the names of their friends and the dynamics of their friendships, who sat on the floor and played with them, and read to them and took them on walks, and pointed out things in the natural world with the specific enthusiasm of a man who found the world genuinely interesting, and who wanted to transmit that interest to his children. And Emma adored him with the uncomplicated adoration of a small girl for a father who shows up. And Marcus watched him with the serious attention of a small boy who is deciding what kind of man to be by watching the closest available model. My mother visited twice a year. The visits were always managed with a care that I understood better as the years went on, managed in the sense that she was always warm and present and helpful with the children, while James was in the room, and always different. Subtly and consistently different, when he was not. Different in the specific ways that she had been different since March of my junior year, the tone shifting, the observations returning, the questions that were not questions but implications, the portrait of James Voss that she had been painting for years in the negative space of conversations that were ostensibly about other things. And James. I need to tell you about James and my mother, because their relationship was its own story within the larger story. The relationship between a man who genuinely tried and a woman who had decided before she ever met him that trying was not going to be enough. James understood that my mother was difficult. He was not naive about this. He was an intelligent man who was accustomed to reading complex situations with precision, and he read my mother with reasonable accuracy from early on. Understood that her warmth was performed, and that her concerns were strategic, and that the space she occupied in my life was larger than he was comfortable with, and that challenging that space directly would create conflict that would fall on me. And he therefore made the specific patient choice to be endlessly kind to her, to show up for every visit with the same openness and the same genuine effort, to find things in her that he genuinely liked, which he could do, because Margaret Calloway was a woman who had genuine qualities beneath the management, who was intelligent and well-read and capable of warmth when it was not strategic, and James found those qualities and engaged with them, and was consistently gracious to a woman who was consistently working against him in ways he could not directly address, without causing harm to me. This graciousness was, I would later understand, part of what made my mother most afraid of him, because a man who is gracious under persistent low-grade hostility is a man who is committed, who is in it for the long term, who is not going to be managed out of a relationship through the gradual accumulation of doubt. And my mother recognized this and escalated in the way that controllers escalate when the usual methods are not producing the desired result. The escalation took the form of a campaign, though I did not recognize it as a campaign at the time, because campaigns, by definition, are disguised as something else. And this one was disguised as concern, as motherly worry, as the legitimate anxiety of a parent who was observing things about her daughter Bergent that she was afraid to name directly, but that she felt obligated to mention obliquely. The way you mention obliquely something you are afraid will cause pain, which is the most effective disguise, because it wraps the damage in the appearance of love, and the appearance of love is the most disarming thing there is. She began suggesting, in the 3rd year of our marriage, that James seemed unhappy. She said it with the tone of someone sharing a painful observation that she had been sitting with for a while, and had finally decided she owed me because she loved me too much to keep it to herself. And she said it with enough specific detail drawn from the visits and from things I had mentioned in phone calls that she had been cataloging, to make it feel credible, to make it feel like something she had seen, rather than something she had constructed. She said he seemed distant. She said he seemed preoccupied. She said she had noticed, at the last visit, a quality in the way he looked at me that she found concerning, and when I asked what quality, she said she wasn't sure exactly, that it was more a feeling than a specific thing, and this vagueness was strategic, because vague concerns are the hardest to dispel, because they have no specific form to refute. You cannot disprove a feeling. You cannot produce evidence against an impression, and so the concern sat in my mind without a specific shape, but with a specific weight. The weight of something a person who loves you has noticed and found troubling. I did not believe her, exactly. I want to be clear about that, because I need you to understand that the lie was not something I simply accepted and built my life on without question. I was not that passive. I pushed back on the concern. I told her that James was fine, that the marriage was good, that she was seeing things that weren't there. And she said, of course, she hoped she was wrong. She just loved me and wanted me to be paying attention. And the paying attention was the point. The paying attention was what she wanted. Because a person who is paying attention to the wrong things is a person who will eventually see those things, simply through the persistence of looking. She was also working on James directly, which I would not understand until much later. She was saying things to James during the visits, in the moments when I was with the children, or in the kitchen, or otherwise occupied. Things that were designed to create in him the specific doubt that she was simultaneously creating in me. The doubt about the relationship itself, about whether it was working, about whether the things she had observed were real, and whether the marriage was as solid as both of us believed it to be. And James, to his enormous credit, did not tell me about these conversations for a long time, because he was afraid that telling me would force me to choose between my mother and my husband, and he was not willing to put me in that position. And this protectiveness, this refusal to weaponize his knowledge of my mother's behavior, was both noble and costly, because it meant that I was not receiving the information I needed to see the full picture. The crisis came when Marcus was 3 and Emma was 6. James had been offered a significant professional opportunity in Seattle, a position with a major environmental consulting firm that represented a substantial step forward in his career, and we had discussed it, James and I, in the way that married people discuss major decisions, with honesty about what it would mean for both of us and genuine effort to find the path that was best for the family as a whole. And I had concerns about the move, legitimate concerns about uprooting the children, and about leaving a city we had built a life in, But I was also genuinely supportive of James's career and genuinely willing to consider the move if the details could be worked out in a way that addressed my concerns. My mother found out about the Seattle opportunity during a phone call in which I mentioned it, and what happened next is what I now understand to have been the moment at which she made the decision. The specific calculated decision that would govern the next decade of our lives. The decision that I still cannot fully comprehend even now when I have had years to try. She came to Denver. She said she wanted to help with the children while James and I figured out the Seattle question, which was a reasonable offer, and which I accepted because I had a demanding week at work, and the children needed attention, and my mother was good with the children in the genuine way that grandmothers can be good with children. The patience that comes from not being responsible for them every day. The pleasure that comes from loving small people without the exhaustion of primary caretaking. James was traveling for work that week, a 4-day trip to Sacramento for a conference, and my mother arrived on Monday, and we settled into the routine of her visits. The children delighted to have their grandmother's attention, and I grateful for the practical help and the company. And on Tuesday evening, after the children were in bed, my mother sat at my kitchen table and she said, "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." And she told me. What she told me, what she said sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in November, while my children slept in their rooms, and my husband was in Sacramento, was this. She told me that James had spoken to her privately at the last visit and had told her that he was having doubts about the marriage, that he felt constrained, that the family responsibilities were more than he had anticipated, that the Seattle opportunity was not just a career opportunity, but an opportunity to step back from a life that he was finding more difficult than he had expected. She said he had not told me this because he didn't want to hurt me, but that he had told her because he trusted her and because he didn't know what to do, and he needed an outside perspective. She said it with all the specific details that a lie requires to be believed, with the hesitation of someone sharing something painful, with the specific sorrow of a mother who wishes she didn't have to say what she was saying, with the careful framing of someone who loves you and is trying to tell you a hard truth in the gentlest possible way. I want to tell you what I felt in the moment of hearing this because the feeling matters. I felt the specific vertigo of a person whose ground has just shifted, the lurch of reality rearranging itself around new information. And I felt it even though I did not want to believe what she was saying, even though some part of me, the part that knew James, knew the marriage, knew the dailiness of our life together, was producing counter evidence as fast as she was producing evidence. And the counter evidence was substantial, but the allegation was also substantial. And it was coming from my mother, whose love for me, whatever else was true, I had never fundamentally doubted. And the combination of the allegation and the source, and the specificity of the detail, and the exhaustion I was carrying from the week, and the absence of James, who was in Sacramento, and who I therefore could not immediately reach and ask and hear his voice saying the words that would have disproved everything. All of these things combined to produce in me a state of terrified uncertainty that was, I understand now, exactly what my mother had engineered. I called James that night. He answered immediately, which he always did, and his voice was warm and present, and exactly the voice of a man who is not in Sacramento planning his departure from his marriage. And when I told him what my mother had said, there was a silence, a long and specific silence that I read at the time as guilt, and that I understand now was the silence of a man who is absorbing an accusation so outrageous that his mind is running through the implications faster than his voice can keep up. The silence of a man who is understanding in real time that his mother-in-law has just declared war and that the weapon chosen is the most destructive one available, which is the doubt of the person who loves you most. He denied everything. He denied it clearly and specifically, and with the controlled intensity of someone who is very afraid and who is fighting for something very important. And he asked to speak to my mother, and I handed the phone to my mother. And what followed was a conversation that I listened to from the other side of the kitchen and that I could only half hear, and that ended with my mother handing the phone back to me and saying, quietly and with the specific sorrow of someone who has been confirmed in their worst fears, "He's very upset. That's not necessarily a sign of innocence." And in that moment, in that specific terrible moment, I'd something I will regret for the rest of my life. I believed my mother, not completely, not without reservation, but enough. I believed her enough to be afraid, enough to be uncertain, enough to allow the seed of doubt that she had been growing for years to break through the surface and become something I could see, something I could not ignore, something that sat between me and James when he came home from Sacramento, and that neither of us knew how to address. Because the thing my mother had alleged was the kind of thing that cannot be disproved to the satisfaction of a person who is afraid it might be true. And James, who could see that I was afraid, who could see that something had shifted, who did not yet fully understand the scale and the deliberateness of what my mother had done, tried to reach me and found the fear between us, and tried to address the fear, and found that addressing it required my mother to admit what she had done. And my mother would not admit what she had done. What followed was 3 weeks of the most painful conversations of my marriage. Conversations that went in circles, because they were organized around a lie that neither James nor I could see clearly enough to name. Conversations that exhausted us both, and that frightened me more than the original accusation. Because the conversations themselves were evidence of damage. Evidence that something had gotten into the marriage that was disrupting it. And the irony was that the disruption was the evidence my mother needed to point to and say, quietly and with sorrow, you see, something is wrong, I was right to be concerned. And then my mother did the thing that I did not see coming, the thing that I still cannot fully explain or justify or understand in any framework that makes human sense. The thing that makes every other thing in this story possible, the thing that she did while I was already confused and afraid, and uncertain and exhausted, and while James and I were in the middle of the worst period of our marriage, and while the Seattle question was still unresolved, and while the children were too young to understand anything, except that something was wrong in the house, and that the adults were unhappy, and that the specific quality of something that was not going to resolve itself quickly. That was not going to resolve itself quickly. She suggested I take the children and come home to Billings for a visit. Just a visit, she said. Just some time and space and distance to think clearly, to step outside the situation and see it from outside rather than from inside, which is advice that sounds reasonable, and that is sometimes reasonable, and that in this specific situation was the first step in a plan that she had already made. A plan so far beyond what I could have imagined her capable of that the possibility of it existing did not occur to me even as she was executing it. I took the children to Billings. I left James in Denver with the understanding that we needed some time and space, and that I would call, and we would talk, and that the time and space would give us both the clarity to have the conversations that we needed to have. I took Emma, who was 6 and who was excited to see her grandparents, and Marcus, who was 3 and who did not understand what was happening, but who was happy anywhere that had a grandmother. And I drove to Billings on a Friday in January, with the children in the back seat, and the specific exhausted confusion of a woman who is in the middle of something she does not yet fully understand, and who is making decisions based on incomplete information, which is the most dangerous kind of decision-making, and also sometimes the only kind available. I was in Billings for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, several things happened that I need to tell you about carefully, because they are the mechanism by which my mother's plan operated, the specific steps by which a situation that began as a marriage crisis was transformed into something entirely different, something that would take a decade to begin to unravel. James called every day, every single day, sometimes multiple times, and the calls were the calls of a man who was fighting for his marriage with everything he had, calls that were simultaneously loving and frustrated and desperate and clear. And I received those calls in my mother's house, in the bedroom I had grown up in the specific emotional context of my childhood home, where my mother's reality had always been the dominant one, where her framing of things had always been the frame within which I understood things, and the calls that were clear in their content were received in a context that made them less clear, that layered them with the doubt and the fear that my mother was actively maintaining and refreshing through the conversations she had with me every evening after the children were in bed. She told me things, new things, additions to the original lie, elaborations that made the picture she had painted more detailed and more specific and more difficult to disbelieve, things that James had allegedly said to her on different occasions, things that alleged other patterns of concern in his character, other indications that the man I had married was not the man I believed him to be. And she told me these things in the specific tone of a woman who is reluctant to say what she is saying, who wishes she did not have to say it, who is saying it only because she loves me too much to let me go back without knowing what she knows. And I want to say something here that is very important and very difficult, which is that my mother's love for me was real. I believe this. I have believed it through everything, and I still believe it now. Not because it excuses anything, but because I think it is true. And because understanding that a person can love you genuinely and still do you tremendous harm is one of the most important and most painful lessons available to a human being. The specific lesson that love is not sufficient protection against damage when the love is wrapped around a need for control that the person cannot see clearly enough to manage. She loved me and she was afraid of losing me, and she did not trust James not to take me away from her in the specific way that husbands take wives away from mothers. The way that the centripetal force of a marriage pulls two people toward each other and away from everything else. And she could not tolerate the losing, could not tolerate being on the outside of my life looking in. And what she did in response to that intolerance was the thing that people do when their love becomes indistinguishable from their fear, which is that they destroy the thing that threatens them before it can threaten them. And James Voss was the thing that threatened her, and she destroyed him. The morning I need to tell you about is a Monday morning in the 4th week of my time in Billings, a morning that began like the other mornings, with breakfast, and the children and my mother's kitchen, and the ordinary routines of a visit that had extended beyond its original intention. And in the middle of that morning, my mother sat across from me at her kitchen table and she said, in a voice that was calm and deliberate and entirely controlled, "Eleanor, James called me last night." I said, "He calls me every day." She said, "He called me separately, after he called you." And then she told me what he had allegedly said in this alleged private call, and what he allegedly said was that he wanted out. That he had decided that the marriage was not working. That he felt more free in Denver without us there. That he had been thinking about the Seattle opportunity not as a step forward for the family, but as a step away from the family. And she said he had asked her not to tell me right away, because he wasn't sure how to have the conversation with me himself, and he wanted time to think about how to say it. The specific details she gave me were so precise, so particular, the kind of specific that fabrication rarely achieves, that I should have recognized them as the product of deliberate construction rather than actual events. But I was exhausted and afraid, and 3 weeks into a period of sustained doubt, and I was in my mother's house, and she was the most constant presence in my life, and she was the most telling something wheeze in the voice that she reserved for the truest and most important things she had ever said to me, and I believed her. And then my mother said, "Eleanor, I think you should start fresh. I think you should stay here in Billings and build a life here. And I think the children should grow up here, near their grandmother, in a place where they are safe and where I can help you. And I think James, if he really feels the way he told me he feels, will eventually understand that this is the right thing." I looked at my mother. I looked at her across the kitchen table of the house I had grown up in, and I felt the specific, complex weight of a moment that is changing things permanently, the moment at which you are making a decision that cannot be unmade, and I understood that she was asking me to end my marriage and staying in Billings. And I understood that she was framing this as a response to James's alleged desires, rather than as a response to her own. And I understood that something was wrong, that the wrongness was somewhere in what I was being told, that somewhere in the architecture of the story she was telling me, there was a structural flaw that I could feel without being able to locate. And I did not act on that feeling because acting on it would have required me to accuse my mother of lying. And I could not do that. I could not stand in my mother's kitchen and say, "You are lying to me." Because the accusation required a certainty I didn't have. And because the consequences of being wrong were too large. And because I was a woman who had been taught since childhood that you trust the people who love you, and that doubt is a form of disloyalty, and that my mother had never given me a reason to believe she would lie to me about something this important. I did not stay in Billings. I need to be clear about that. What I did was go back to Denver, but I went back to Denver in a state of such profound and sustained confusion and fear that the going back was not really a return, not a resumption of what had been there before. And what happened when I returned to Denver is the part of the story that I have the most difficulty telling, because it is the part in which I made the decision that caused the most harm, not my mother's decision, not her lie, but my decision, made from inside a situation that had been constructed to produce exactly the decision I made. But my decision nonetheless, the decision that I am responsible for in the full weight of that responsibility, even as I understand the context in which it was made. I told James I needed to separate. I told him I needed time and space to understand what was happening in the marriage and what I wanted, and whether the marriage was something we could recover. And I told him that I was going to take the children to Billings for a period. Not permanently, for a period, to give us both the space we needed. And James looked at me with the specific, terrible look of a man who is watching something he loves disappearing, and who cannot find the lever that stops it, because the mechanism by which it is disappearing is hidden from him. And he said, "Eleanor, please don't do this. I don't know what your mother has told you, but whatever it is, I need you to trust me. I need you to stay here and talk to me, because if you go, I am afraid of what happens next." I heard him. I heard the fear and the love and the desperation in his voice, and I felt all of those things in my own body, as if they were mine and not his. And I went to Billings anyway, and I took the children, and I did not come back. What happened in the weeks and months after I went to Billings is a story that I have had to reconstruct partly from my up memory and partly from what James told me later, because my experience of those months and his experience of those months were entirely different, and the reconstruction of both is necessary to understand the full picture of what was done. From my side, I was in Billings with the children, in the house my parents had prepared for us, a small house 2 streets from my parents' home that they had been renting out and that they offered to us at no cost, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted and what was true, and whether my marriage was recoverable, and whether the things my mother had told me were things that James had actually said, or things that she had said he said, and the uncertainty was constant and exhausting. And I was managing 2 small children, and working remotely at the communications job that I had been fortunate enough to be able to do from anywhere. And my mother was present and helpful and unwavering in her support, and in her gentle, persistent maintenance of the narrative she had constructed, the narrative in which James had revealed himself to be less committed to the marriage than I had believed, and in which my decision to be in Billings was the right one for me and for the children. James was in Denver, calling every day, calling multiple times, calling with the specific frantic energy of a man who is watching his life disappear and who cannot understand why the people he calls are not stopping the disappearance. He called me, and I answered sometimes, and didn't answer other times, because the calls were painful, and because the pain was producing in me the specific exhausted withdrawal that confusion produces when you have been in it too long. The desire to not have the conversation because the conversation goes nowhere and produces nothing except more pain. He called my parents' house, and my father answered sometimes, kind and uncomfortable, and my mother answered sometimes, and what she said to James when she answered, I did not know for many years, but what I know now, what James told me, is that she said things that were designed to confirm the decision I was in the process of making, that she said I was thinking clearly for the first time in years, that I needed him to give me space, that the best thing he could do for me was let me come to my own conclusions without pressure. And James, who was trying desperately to respect the woman he loved whilst also fighting for the marriage, tried to do what she was asking, and the trying was used against him, the space he gave being presented to me as evidence of the distance she had alleged. And then my mother did the final thing, the thing that converted a separation into something permanent, the thing that made everything that followed possible. She told me he had stopped calling. He had not stopped calling. He called for months. He called until his calls went to a voicemail that my mother had arranged, in ways I still do not fully understand, to not receive his messages, to intercept them. And I do not know all the technical details of how this was accomplished, because my mother was not a technical person, but she was a determined one, and determination, in my mother's case, always found a way, and she arranged things so that I believed James had stopped calling, while James believed I was receiving his calls and choosing not to respond, and the mutual silence that was constructed from his continued attempts, and my non-receipt of them, was the specific silence of a separation that has become a finality. And inside that silence, my mother told me that James had decided to accept the Seattle position, and that his silence was his way of confirming that he agreed with my decision, and that we were, effectively, done. I believed her. I believed her because the silence was real. I was experiencing it as real. And because the thing she was telling me confirmed the fear that she had been cultivating in me for years, the fear that James's commitment was contingent, and because I was exhausted and grief-stricken and managing 2 small children alone, and because the alternative to believing her was too enormous, required too much of me, required me to stand in a truth about my mother that I was not yet capable of standing in. I filed for a divorce. The papers were served to James in Denver, and he received them, and he came to Billings. He drove the 9 hours to Billings, and he came to my parents' house and knocked on the door, and my mother answered, and she did not let him in. And what was said at that door is something I did not witness because I was at the small house 2 streets away. And what I know about it is what James told me years later, which is that my mother told him that I did not want to see him, that I had made my decision, that the children were settling into their new life, and that his presence was disrupting that settling, and that the best thing he could do for his children was to allow them to adjust to the new reality without the confusion of his presence. And she said this with the specific authority of a woman who has organized the situation in advance so that her words align with an apparent reality. So that the silence I was experiencing seemed to confirm what she was saying. And James, who did not yet understand the full extent of what had been done, who was still operating in the belief that the situation was as it appeared, that I had chosen this, that I had made this decision freely, and with full information, drove back to Denver and called a lawyer and tried to access his parental rights through the legal system. The legal system. This is the part that James has told me about with the specific, controlled anger of someone who has processed their grief over many years, and who has arrived at a place where the anger does not govern the telling but is present in it. The part that he has described to me in detail. Because he needed me to understand what the years looked like from his side, what the 10 years of searching looked like from inside the searching. And I have listened to this account with the specific, devastating attention of a woman who is hearing a story about harm that she was partly responsible for and that she cannot undo. And I want to tell you what he told me because it is the part of the story that deserves to be fully seen. He filed for custody. He retained a family law attorney in Denver, and then in Montana when the case was established as a Montana matter, because that was where we were residing. And he entered the legal process with everything he had, with the faith that the legal system would recognize his rights as a father and would give him access to his children. And what he found was a process that was slower and more expensive and more emotionally brutal than anything he had anticipated, a process that my mother, who had been planning and preparing for longer than he knew, had anticipated better than he had, and had prepared for with the specific, patient thoroughness that she brought to everything she organized. She had retained a lawyer in Billings before James filed anything, which tells you everything you need to know about the degree of premeditation involved. And the lawyer was good, local, well-connected in the Billings legal community. And the case that was built on the narrative that my mother had been constructing for years. The narrative of a father whose commitment had been in question, who had expressed doubts about the marriage, who had been considering opportunities that would take him away from the family. And the narrative had enough texture and enough specific detail and enough of my own confused testimony given by a woman who genuinely did not understand the full picture of what she was testifying about, to be credible, to be the kind of narrative that a court evaluates and finds more compelling than the other side's denial. James was given supervised visitation. Not the joint custody he had sought, not the access to his children that any reasonably engaged father deserves, but supervised visitation. A few hours every few months in a setting that was designed to feel punitive to both him and the children. And the children were young enough that the supervised visits were confusing and distressing rather than connecting. That Emma, who had adored her father, was now in an environment where she was being told, in the subtle, pervasive way that children are told things without words, that her father was someone to be cautious about, someone whose presence required supervision, someone who was not to be trusted with her in the ordinary way that fathers are trusted with their children. And then my mother did the last thing, the thing that takes everything from the category of terrible and puts it into a category for which I do not have adequate language. She told me James had given up. She told me the supervised visits had become too painful for him, that he had told his lawyer he could not continue in a situation that was this damaging to everyone, that he had decided for the sake of the children to step back. He had not decided this. He was fighting. He was still fighting, still calling his lawyer, still filing motions, still appearing at court dates, still doing everything the legal process allowed him to do. And my mother was intercepting the information about this, the same way she had intercepted the phone calls, through the management of the specific points of contact, through which I received information about James, through the control of what reached me and what did not. And I did not know he was still fighting because I was not receiving the information that would have told me he was fighting. And in the absence of that information, I believed, because she told me that he had withdrawn. And then she told me he had moved to Seattle. And then she told me, in the spring of the year Marcus turned 3, that James had been in a car accident, a serious one, on a highway outside of Denver, late at night in the rain, and that he had not survived. She told me with tears in her eyes and genuine grief in her voice. Grief that I now understand was not grief for James, but grief for herself, for the person she had been before she made the decision that she made, for the woman she might have been if she had been capable of loving her daughter, without needing to own her. And she told me, and I believed her because she was my mother, and because this was the specific kind of thing that a mother would not lie to her daughter about. The death of the father of her children. And I believed it with the full and devastating weight of believing something terrible that is also, in the way that terrible things are sometimes also other things, a relief. Because the uncertainties was over and the legal battles were over, and I could grieve clearly and completely and move forward into a life that was no longer organized around a conflict. I told the children. I told Emma, who was 6, sitting on the edge of her bed in the small house 2 streets from my parents, and Emma looked at me with her father's eyes and she said, "But where did he go?" And I said, "He went somewhere we can't see him, baby, but he'll always be with us." And Emma cried in the specific whole-body way that 6-year-olds cry. With nothing held back, everything felt completely and expressed completely. And I held her and I cried with her. And the grief was real. It was entirely real. We were grieving a real person and a real love and a real loss. The only thing that was not real was that the person was not dead. I told Marcus, who was 3, in a way appropriate for 3, in the simplified language of a parent explaining death to a small child. And Marcus looked at me with his father's eyes, those dark and serious eyes that James has, and he said, "Will he come back?" And I said, "No, sweetheart, he won't." And Marcus accepted this with the specific, quiet acceptance of a small child who does not yet have the language to ask the questions that would reveal the lie. Emma wore a locket from that year on. She found a photograph of James, one of the few I had kept, and she put it in a small gold locket that my mother bought for her, and she wore it every day, the weight of it at her throat, a physical manifestation of the grief that she carried. And I watched my daughter wear her dead father's photograph around her neck for 11 years, and I held that grief as if it were my own, and in a way it was my own, because I was grieving James genuinely, grieving the marriage and the man and the loss of the life we had been building. And the genuineness of my grief was part of what made my mother's lie so sustainable. Because a woman who is genuinely grieving does not scrutinize the information that produced her grief, does not audit the source of her loss, does not look carefully at the circumstances of a death that has already happened and that she is already inside the grief of. The years passed, Emma grew, Marcus grew. I built a life in Billings that was real and full and mine in the ways that a life you build from the materials available to you is yours, a job I was good at, and that grew into a career I was proud of, friends who were genuine and present, the specific community of a town where I had grown up, and where my name was known, and where I was not a stranger, and my parents were present and helpful, and my mother was the center of a family life that revolved around her kitchen, and her opinions, and her management of the shape of things. And I accepted this because I had always accepted it, and because the acceptance was the price of the stability, and the stability was what the children needed, and what I needed and what I was grateful for, even as I sensed, in the way that a person senses something beneath the level of conscious awareness, that the stability was bought at a cost I had not fully tallied. My father died when Marcus was 12. A heart attack, quick and devastating and entirely unexpected, the specific cruelty of the sudden loss as opposed to the long loss, and I grieved my father with the full and uncomplicated grief of a daughter who loved him without reservation. And his death changed the configuration of our family in ways that I felt but could not have fully articulated. Because with my father gone, my mother's management of everything became more visible, more undiluted. Because there was no longer the buffering presence of a person who loved her, and who, in loving her, created the softening of her edges that love produces. And the management, without the buffer, was more recognizable as management, more visible for what it was. And I began, in the years after my father's death, to see things I had not been seeing clearly before, to feel the edges of what my life had been shaped into, and to wonder. In the way that a person wonders when they begin to wake up from something, what it would have looked like if it had been shaped differently. Marcus was 17 when he first asked me about his father. He had asked before, of course, in the way that children ask about dead parents, the questions appropriate to each developmental stage, and I had answered each time with the answers I had, which were the answers my mother had given me. And Marcus had received them and moved on, as children move on, into the next stage and the next set of questions. But the question he asked at 17 was different, more specific, more probing, and what he said was, "Mom, did you ever see the accident report? From Dad's accident?" I looked at my son. He was sitting at the kitchen table, this tall 17-year-old with his father's eyes and his father's way of going still when he was thinking, and he was looking at me with a directness that was both familiar and unsettling. The directness of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided to bring it into the open. I said, "I don't think so. Your grandmother handled the arrangements," he said, "because I looked him up online." My throat tightened. I said, "You did?" He said, "There's no death record, Mom. I searched the Denver death records and there's no James Voss who died in a car accident around the time Grandma said he died. I searched the newspaper archives for car accident coverage. There's nothing." I sat down. The kitchen went very still around me. My son looked at me with those eyes, his father's eyes, and I felt something happening in my chest that was not quite a feeling I had felt before. The specific sensation of a structure I had been living inside beginning to move, the walls shifting slightly, the floor developing a quality of uncertainty beneath my feet that had not been there a moment before. I said, "Marcus, where did you look?" He said, "Online. Also, I called the Colorado Vital Records office. You can request a death certificate." I requested one. He put a piece of paper on the table. A letter from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, Office of Vital Records. A letter saying that no death certificate existed for James Robert Voss in the state of Colorado in the year my mother had said he died, or in the year before or the year after. I looked at that piece of paper for a very long time. I looked at it the way you look at something that is changing everything you thought you knew, slowly and carefully, and with the specific attention of someone who understands that what they are looking at is going to require them to rebuild something they thought was already built. I said, "Marcus, where is your grandmother?" He said, "She went to her quilting circle. She won't be back for 2 hours." I picked up the phone. I called the Colorado Vital Records office myself and confirmed what the letter said, that there was no record, that the search had been complete, that a James Robert Voss matching the date of birth I provided had not died in Colorado in the years in question. Then I searched, with my son sitting across the table from me. I sat at my kitchen table, and I searched online with the specific, methodical attention of someone who has just understood that they have been looking for something in the wrong place for a very long time, and who has now been given the correct location. I found him in 45 minutes. James Robert Voss, 51 years old, environmental consultant, Portland, Oregon. LinkedIn profile, professional website, photographs, the same dark eyes, the same way of holding his jaw. Older, of course, the specific aging of a decade, but unmistakably him, unmistakably the man I had married and grieved, and whose photograph my daughter wore in a locket around her neck. He was not dead. He had never been dead. He was in Portland, Oregon, and he was alive. Marcus looked at the screen, and then looked at me, and then looked at the screen again. And neither of us said anything for a very long time. And the silence was the silence of two people who are inside the first moments of understanding something so large that language is inadequate to it, something that requires a period of simply sitting inside the understanding before any of the words appropriate to it become available. Marcus said, finally, very quietly, "Grandma." I said, "Yes." He said, "She lied to us." I said, "Yes." He said, "All of it?" I said, "I don't know yet how much of it, but yes, she lied." Marcus stood up and put on his coat and walked out the door. And I let him go, 'cause I understood that what he needed in that moment was air and distance, and the specific solitude that a person needs when they are processing something too large for the presence of other people. And I sat at my kitchen table alone, and I looked at James Voss's photograph on my screen. And I thought about Emma, 17 years old and wearing her dead father's photograph in a locket, and I thought about what I was going to do next. What I did next was not call my mother. Not yet. What I did was call a private investigator whose name I had found through a colleague, a woman named Sandra Park, who specialized in locating people and verifying information, and I told her what I had found and what I needed, which was confirmation that the James Voss I had found online was the same James Voss I had been married to, and that he was alive and residing in Portland, Oregon, and that he had been alive for the entire period, during which my mother had said he was dead. Sandra confirmed everything within 48 hours. She confirmed his identity, his address, his professional history, and she confirmed something else, something I had not asked her to find, but that she found in the course of her investigation, which was that James Voss had spent years attempting to locate his children through legal channels and had filed multiple motions in multiple jurisdictions, and had hired his own investigators and had been in contact with missing persons organizations, and had, at some point in the past several years, reached a state of legal and investigative exhaustion that was not the same as giving up, because giving up requires a decision. And James had never made the decision, but that resembled giving up from the outside, because the external actions had stopped even though the internal commitment had not. He was not looking for us in the active investigative sense any longer. But he had not stopped believing we were findable. He had not stopped thinking about his children every day. He had not stopped hoping. Sandra told me this with the specific, careful delivery of a professional who understands that the information she is providing has emotional weight and who has enough experience with this kind of work to know when to be gentle without being soft. And I received it in the specific way that I received everything in those days, with the combination of devastation and clarity that comes from finally seeing something you had been not seeing for a very long time. I told Emma. I told her on a Sunday evening, 2 weeks after Marcus and I had found the LinkedIn profile. 2 weeks during which I had done the investigation and spoken to Sandra and spoken to a lawyer and had had a conversation with my mother that I need to tell you about separately because it deserves its own space in this telling. Emma was 17, and she was sitting in her room with the locket around her neck, and I knocked on her door and she said, "Come in." And I came in and I sat on the edge of her bed, the way mothers sit on the edge of their children's beds when they have something important to say, and I looked at my daughter, and I looked at the locket, and I said, "Emma, I need to tell you something about your father." She looked at me. She had her father's eyes, and in that moment, I could not look at her without seeing him, and I understood that I had been seeing him in her face for 17 years and not allowing myself to fully know what I was seeing. I told her the truth, all of it, as clearly and as completely as I could, in the language appropriate for a 17-year-old who is about to have the central organizing fact of her grief dismantled and rebuilt as something entirely different, the language of honesty and love, and the specific sorrow of a mother who is telling her daughter something that should never have needed to be told. Emma was very still while I talked. She did not interrupt. She held the locket in both hands, pressed against her chest, and she listened to everything I said, and when I finished, she looked at me and she said, "He's alive." I said, "Yes." She said, "All this time." I said, "Yes." She said, "And Grandma." She didn't finish the sentence. I said, "Yes." Emma sat with that for a long moment. Then she looked at the locket in her hands and she opened it. And she looked at her father's photograph, the photograph she had looked at every day for 11 years. And she closed it again and she held it and she said, "I want to see him." I said, "I know. We're going to make that happen." The conversation with my mother was the hardest conversation I have ever had. Harder than telling the children. Harder than the phone call I eventually made to James. Harder than anything I have experienced before or since, because it required me to be fully present in the truth of what had been done, while also being present with the woman who had done it, to hold both the love and the betrayal in the same moment without allowing either to cancel the other. And this is the hardest thing a person can do. I have learned, harder than grief and harder than anger, harder than anything, this simultaneous holding of love and harm in relation to the same person. I went to her house. I sat across from her at the table where she had told me, 10 years earlier, that James had been in a car accident and had not survived. And I laid the evidence on the table the way I had laid it out for myself, and I said, "Tell me the truth." My mother looked at the evidence. She looked at it for a long time. And then she said something that I have thought about every day since. Something that lives in me as one of the most painful and most illuminating things anyone has ever said to me. Something that explained everything and excused nothing, and that revealed the full depth of what had been operating beneath the surface of my mother's love for all of my life. She said, I couldn't lose you, just that. No elaborate justification. No attempt to reframe the lie as something other than what it was. Just, I couldn't lose you. In the voice of a woman who had organized 10 years of other people's lives, and other people's grief, and other people's loss, around the specific impossibility of her own loss, who had decided that her inability to tolerate the losing of her daughter was a sufficient justification for the destruction of a marriage, the erasure of a father, the manufactured grief of 2 children, and the theft of 10 years from a man who had done nothing wrong except love someone whose mother could not share. I looked at my mother. I looked at her for a long time, and then I said, you have to understand that I cannot forgive this, not now. I don't know if ever. What you did to my children, what you did to James, what you did to me, the specific enormity of it, is beyond what I have the capacity to forgive right now. And I need you to understand that whatever happens next, whatever relationship we have or don't have, it will be built on the truth. And the truth is that you destroyed something irreplaceable because you couldn't tolerate the possibility of losing something you never had the right to hold. My mother cried. She cried in the specific, total way of someone who has been carrying something enormous for years, and who has finally put it down, and who feels the weight of it only as it leaves. And I watched her cry, and I did not comfort her, because comfort in that moment would have been dishonest, and I was done with dishonesty. Done with the gentle framing and the generous interpretation and the management of difficult truths in ways designed to protect people who did not deserve the protection. I made the phone call to James on a Tuesday morning. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my hands shaking slightly, and I called the number Sandra had given me. And it rang 3 times, and then he answered. His voice the same and different, older. The voice of a man who has lived a decade that has changed him. And I said his name, and the silence that followed was the longest silence I have ever experienced. Longer than the silence after I told Marcus, longer than the silence after I told Emma, the specific silence of a man who has heard a voice he believed he would never hear again and who is verifying in real time that what he is hearing is real. He said my name, just my name, and I said, James, the children are alive. They are here. They are well. And I need you to know that I did not know. The legal process of reconnecting James with his children was longer than I wished it was and shorter than it could have been because we were not adversaries. James and I, we were 2 people who had both been harmed by the same thing, and who were both committed to the children's well-being, and who had enough remaining foundation of respect and history to build a process on that was not destructive, that was as careful and as child-centered as 2 people in an extraordinary situation can make a process. Emma met her father in a courthouse hallway in Portland, Oregon, because Portland was where James lived, and because we had come to Portland for the initial meeting, because meeting there, on his ground, was the right thing to do, and I wanted to do the right things from this point forward, without reservation or calculation. She was 17 years old, and she walked down that hallway with the locket in her hand, not around her neck but in her hand, held open so that the photograph faced outward. And she walked toward a man who was standing 12 feet away with his hands at his sides and tears on his face. And she stopped 3 feet from him, and she looked at him for a long time. This man who had been a photograph in a locket for 11 years. This man who was standing in 3 dimensions in front of her, real and present and entirely not dead. And she said, I wore your picture every day. And he said, I know, though he didn't know exactly. He learned it in that moment. And then Emma put the locket in her pocket, and she stepped forward and she put her arms around her father, and she held on, and James held on, and I stood at the end of the hallway, and I watched my daughter and the man she had grieved for hold each other in a courthouse hallway in Portland. And I felt something that was not happiness and not grief and not relief and not anger, and was all of those things simultaneously. The specific, complex feeling of a person who is watching something being partially restored that can never be fully restored. Something being healed that will always carry the scar of the wound. Something being rebuilt that will always have the footprint of what was destroyed in the foundation. Marcus's meeting was different because Marcus was different. Because Marcus came to his father not with the locket and photograph grief of his sister, but with the controlled, analytical focus of a young man who had spent 3 years processing the information, and who came to James with questions as much as emotion, with the need to understand as much as the need to connect. He asked James to tell him about the 10 years of searching, the locomotions and the investigators and the court dates and the letters. And James told him, in detail, in the specific and honest way that Marcus needed, and Marcus listened to all of it, and then he said, "You never stopped." James said, "No." Marcus said, "I want to know you." James said, "That's all I've ever wanted." The relationship between James and his children is a work in progress, which is what any relationship is. But, which in this case is also a description of a specific kind of reconstruction that happens when you are building something new on top of something that was deliberately destroyed, where the materials are genuine and the intention is genuine, but the foundation has to be tested and strengthened in ways that a foundation that was never damaged does not require. Emma and James talk on the phone twice a week. She visited Portland for 2 weeks last summer and came back different in a way I can only describe as more complete. As if a part of her that had been missing was not fully restored, but was at least accounted for, was at least acknowledged as having existed and continuing to exist, and being worth the effort of connecting with. Marcus is in the process of deciding what kind of relationship he wants with his father, which is his right, which I have told him clearly is his right, and he is taking the time he needs, and James is giving him the time he needs, and I believe that what they will build when Marcus is ready will be real and lasting and genuinely theirs. My mother is in a care facility now. She had a stroke 18 months ago, the specific cruel irony of a woman who managed everything finding herself in a situation she cannot manage. And she requires full-time care that she is receiving in a facility that is clean and professional and where she is treated with dignity. And I visit her twice a month, not because I have forgiven her, not because what she did has been resolved in any way that would be described as resolution, but because she is my mother, and she is sick and visiting her is the right thing to do. And I have decided that I want to be a person who does the right thing even when the person the right thing is done for does not deserve it. Because doing the right thing is not about what the recipient deserves, it is about who you are. James has visited my mother once. He went alone, without telling me he was going until after, and he sat with her for 2 hours, and she recognized him. The stroke has not taken her recognition, and he told me what was said to her, which was that he wanted her to know that her grandchildren were well, and that they knew their father, and that whatever she had intended, the outcome was not what she had planned, because her daughter and her grandchildren were strong enough to build something from the wreckage, and that the wreckage was real and the building was also real, and both were true simultaneously. He said she cried. He said he sat with her while she cried, and he did not comfort her because he could not honestly comfort her, but he stayed, and the staying was its own kind of grace, the grace of a person who has been harmed, and who chooses presence over withdrawal, which is the hardest choice and the most human one. James and I have had many conversations in the 3 years since the initial phone call, conversations that have been honest and painful, and sometimes surprisingly easy, and sometimes entirely devastating. Conversations that have covered the full territory of what happened, and what it cost, and what remains, and what is possible. We have not rebuilt a marriage. The marriage ended, in the only sense that matters when my mother destroyed it, and what exists between us now is not the marriage but is not nothing, is something that has no established name. The specific relationship between two people who loved each other, and were separated by deliberate harm, and who have come back into each other's lives through their children, and who respect each other, and who hold the shared history of something that was good and that was taken, and who have had to decide, together and separately, what to do with the holding. We have decided to be in each other's lives, not as a couple, not as enemies, as the parents of two remarkable people, as the holders of a shared history that belongs to both of us, as two people who were wronged by the same person, and who have chosen to respond to the wrong by building something rather than by amplifying the destruction. Emma asked me once what I would have done differently if I had known. If I had seen through my mother's lie at any point in the years it was being told. If I had trusted James's voice on the phone, or my own knowledge of his character, or the counter-evidence that my own experience of our marriage was producing even as my mother was producing the lie. I told her the truth, which is that I don't know, which is that the question of what I would have done differently requires me to be a different person than I was at the time. A person with information and perspective and courage that I did not have, and that holding myself responsible for not being a different person is a form of cruelty that does not serve anyone. And that I have been working, with the help of a therapist who has been my companion through this process, to put down. What I do know, what I know with the certainty that only experience produces, is what I would tell any person who says inside a situation in which the people who love them are constructing a reality that does not match what they know to be true. And what I would tell them is this: trust what you know. Trust the information that your own direct experience produces. Trust the voice of the person who loves you when that voice is consistent and present and clear, and when the doubt you feel about that voice is being fed from outside rather than generated from inside. Trust yourself. Because the most devastating thing my mother did was not construct the lie. The most devastating thing was that she made me doubt my own perception of a reality I had direct access to. And the doubt was the weapon. And the doubt was what made everything else possible. And the antidote to that weapon is the specific, practiced, difficult work of trusting what you know, even when the people you love are telling you that you don't know it. My name is Eleanor Voss, and I am 43 years old, and I am sitting in the kitchen of a house in Portland, Oregon, because I moved to Portland 2 years ago, moved to be in the same city as James, not for us but for the children, for the specific, practical gift of geography, of Emma being able to have dinner with her father on a Tuesday, and Marcus being able to drop by on a Saturday. And the children having both their parents in the same city for the first time in their lives. The tea is cold. The morning is quiet. In an hour, Emma is coming over for breakfast. Emma, who is 19 and in her first year of college, and who is studying psychology because she wants to understand people, wants to understand how they make the decisions they make, and what those decisions cost, and what can be recovered from the costs. And she will come in through my kitchen door with the specific energy of a 19-year-old who is building herself. And she will not be wearing the locket because she put the locket away the day she met her father in the courthouse hallway, not because she was done with what the locket represented, but because what it had represented, the presence of someone she loved who she believed was gone, was no longer what was true, and the true thing, the living, present, three-dimensional true thing, was better than the photograph, better than the locket, better than anything that stands in for the thing itself, and what she has now is the thing itself, imperfect and complicated and real and ongoing and hers. And that is everything. That is the whole story. Every word of it is true. And the truth, even when it is this painful, is the only thing worth telling.